It was supposed to be the first peaceful evening in weeks. The moment I had dreamed about since buying this house. Coming home, dropping my bags, sinking into my couch, and just breathing in the quiet. But as I pulled into the driveway, I knew something was wrong. A small crowd stood on my front lawn. Not kids playing, not a welcoming committee. These people were standing stiff, like sentinels. At the center of it all was a woman in a crisp white suit, blonde hair tied back with a severity that matched the tightness in her expression. She held a stack of papers like a sword, her posture screaming authority. I hadn't even stepped out of the car before she spoke. "We need to talk about your house." Now, a sinking feeling gripped my stomach. This wasn't a neighborly check-in. This wasn't a friendly introduction. This was a demand. And I already knew who she was. Karen, the HOA president, the self-appointed ruler of the neighborhood. I forced a smile, stepping out and shutting the car door behind me. "Can I help you with something?" Her lips curled up, not in a smile, but in a smirk of someone who had already won. "You've been violating community regulations." I blinked. "Excuse me?" Karen flipped through her papers dramatically, as if she were about to read me my rights. "Several modifications to your property have been reported. Unauthorized landscaping, failure to obtain pre-approval for exterior repairs, and..." Her eyes flicked up, and she delivered the line like a hammer to my gut. "Outstanding community fees." I felt my pulse quicken. "Community fees?" "Yes," she said, her voice smooth as polished steel. "You're overdue for payments required to maintain compliance with the HOA. You should have received notices." I narrowed my eyes. "I've never received anything." Karen sighed like a disappointed teacher. "That's unfortunate. However, ignorance of the rules doesn't excuse you from them." I crossed my arms. "I own this house outright. What exactly am I paying for?" Her smirk deepened. "For the privilege of living here." I stared at her. The words echoed in my head, but they didn't make sense. Pay rent? For my own house? I let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "You're joking." Karen's eyes were cold and unwavering. "If you refuse, we will take legal action." A beat of silence passed. I could hear my own heartbeat. Legal action? My voice came out sharper than I intended. For existing? For violating community standards? She corrected smoothly. The absurdity of it all hit me like a wave. I had spent years saving for this house. I had poured my energy, my money, my time into making it a home. And now, this woman, this stranger, thought she could hold my life hostage with a fake invoice. I inhaled sharply, forcing down the rising anger. "I'll need to see those regulations." In writing, Karen's expression barely flickered. "Of course." She handed me a pristine white envelope, sealed with an embossed HOA logo. I took it, gripping the paper so tightly my knuckles turned white. "I trust you'll make the right decision," Karen said. I gave her a tight smile. "Oh, I will." She took that as agreement, but she had no idea, because at that moment I had already decided there was no way in hell I was paying her a single dime. As soon as she and her flock retreated down the street, I stormed inside, tossing the envelope onto the counter without opening it. My mind was racing. This wasn't just about me. If Karen was pulling this nonsense on me, she had to be doing it to other homeowners too. I needed to fight back. But first, I needed to know exactly what I was up against. Grabbing my laptop, I started digging. HOA regulations, local housing laws, legal precedents. Anything that could tell me whether Karen's claims held any weight. Within minutes, I found something that sent a chill down my spine. The fees she was demanding, they weren't real. There was nothing in the official HOA documents that supported her claim. No new fees. No mandated compliance payments. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was extortion. My grip tightened on the mouse. Karen thought she could shake me down. She thought I'd roll over, write a check, and move on like nothing happened. She had no idea who she was dealing with. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to my lawyer's number. "Hey," I said as soon as he picked up. "I need some legal advice. Fast." The next morning, I woke up with one goal in mind: getting to the bottom of this. I wasn't just going to let Karen rob me blind under the guise of some fake HOA rule. If she thought she could bully me into submission, she was in for a rude awakening. Before I even got out of bed, I grabbed my phone and dialed my lawyer, Mark. He was the kind of guy who knew every loophole, every legal gray area, and most importantly, how to shut people like Karen down. "She's trying to charge you what?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "A community compliance fee for my own house. And she's threatening legal action if I don't pay." There was a pause, then a chuckle. "She's bluffing." I sat up straighter. "You're sure? Positive? HOA fees have to be explicitly written in the original agreement you signed when you moved in. If there's no documentation backing this up, she's got nothing." Relief washed over me for a second, but it was quickly replaced by a burning sense of determination. "So what do I do?" "First, get evidence. Every letter she sends, every conversation, document everything. If she tries to escalate, we'll hit her with a fraud complaint." I exhaled slowly. "Got it." After hanging up, I went straight to my desk, pulling out a notebook and opening my laptop. If I was going to fight this, I needed to be thorough. First step, the local records office. If Karen had a history of pulling stunts like this, there had to be a paper trail. I arrived just as the office opened, greeted by the usual gray walls, flickering lights, and the scent of old paper. The clerk, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, looked up when I approached. "I'm looking for HOA financial records for my neighborhood," I said. She sighed, pushing up her glasses. "You and half the town," she muttered, shuffling toward the filing cabinets. That got my attention. "Excuse me?" She glanced at me, expression unreadable. "You're not the first person asking about HOA records this month." My stomach tightened. "Do you remember who else was looking?" She gave me a long, knowing look before handing over a thick file. "Take a look for yourself." I grabbed a seat and flipped it open. The first few pages were standard budget reports, nothing out of the ordinary. But then I saw it, handwritten notes, complaints from homeowners, some dating back years, unauthorized fees, threats of legal action, neighbors forced to pay or face consequences. Karen had been pulling the scam for a long time. And worse, no one had ever stopped her. By the time I left the office, my head was spinning. I had proof that Karen was running a full-scale extortion racket. Now, I just needed more people willing to stand up to her. That night, I started knocking on doors. Most neighbors were hesitant at first, giving me wary glances through half-open doors. But when I told them I had proof, real evidence that Karen's HOA demands were bogus, they started listening. Mrs. Stevens, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years, clutched her robe tighter around her frail frame as she stepped onto her porch. "I knew she was crooked," she muttered, shaking her head. "But I didn't think anyone would ever stop her. She wasn't alone." The more I talked, the more stories I heard. A single mother who had been threatened with eviction over an unapproved flower bed. A retired veteran forced to pay thousands in mysterious community upkeep fees. A young couple who had almost lost their home because Karen claimed their driveway color was unacceptable. People had been suffering under Karen's rule for years, too afraid to speak up. But now they had something real, something undeniable. By the time I returned home, I had a list of names. People willing to testify, to fight back. The tide was turning, but Karen wasn't going to go down quietly. I found that out the next morning when I stepped outside and saw what she had done to my property. My mailbox? Gone. My car? Scratched along the side, deep gouges running from front to back. And on my front door, a bright red final warning notice taped right in the center. I ripped it down, my hands shaking with rage. She was escalating. She wanted me scared. She wanted me to back off. Instead, she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Because I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to destroy her. I stood there, gripping the crumpled final warning notice in my hand, heart pounding like a war drum. Karen thought she could intimidate me into submission. She thought a few cheap scare tactics would be enough to make me back down. She was wrong. I stormed inside, grabbed my phone, and dialed Mark. The moment he answered, I didn't waste time with pleasantries. She vandalized my property. A sharp inhale on the other end. Karen, mailbox is gone. My car's been keyed. And she taped a warning on my front door. Mark cursed under his breath. She's getting desperate. That means she knows you're closing in. I ran a hand through my hair, forcing myself to think. How do we use this? We escalate, he said. File a police report for vandalism. If you have security cameras, check the footage. We catch her in the act. We can press charges. A slow smile spread across my face. Oh, I have cameras. I spent the next hour combing through the footage. And then I found it. 2:13 a.m. A shadowy figure crept up my driveway, a can of spray paint in one hand, something sharp in the other. The footage wasn't crystal clear, but it was enough. I paused, zoomed in, and there she was, Karen, in her perfect white blazer, looking over her shoulder before slashing her keys across my car door. I exhaled slowly, adrenaline burning through my veins. Gotcha. I sent the footage to Mark, then to the local police department. Within 30 minutes, I was sitting at the precinct, filing a formal complaint. The officer taking my statement barely batted an eye when I mentioned Karen's name. You're not the first person to come in here with a complaint about her, he muttered. That sent a jolt through me. What do you mean? The officer sighed. She's been running that HOA like a dictatorship for years. But no one's had enough proof to make charges stick. I leaned forward. Do they now? His lips twitched in something close to a smile. That depends on how much you want to fight this. Oh, I was ready to fight. By the time I left the station, I had a copy of my report, a case number, and the knowledge that Karen was now under official investigation. And then I went for the kill. I gathered everything, the footage, the fake fees, the testimonies from neighbors, and sent it all to a local news station. It took less than 24 hours before the first article dropped. Homeowners speak out. HOA president accused of extortion and corruption. Then another. Community in uproar as HOA president faces vandalism allegations. Then a news crew showed up in the neighborhood, interviewing people right on their front lawns. Karen's perfectly controlled world was unraveling at the seams. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get more insane, I got the phone call. A shaky voice on the other end. I need to talk to you. I frowned. Who is this? A pause. Then, my name is Greg. I used to be on the HOA board. I have information you need. My grip on the phone tightened. Where can we meet? 30 minutes later, I was sitting across from Greg in a small diner, watching the man nervously twist his coffee cup in his hands. He was in his 50s, eyes darting to every corner of the room like he expected Karen to burst through the door at any second. She's worse than you think, he said, voice low. This isn't just about extorting homeowners. She's been skimming money from HOA funds for years. Fake maintenance fees, fake improvement projects. She pockets the difference. My stomach twisted. And you have proof. Greg swallowed hard, then reached into his bag, pulling out a thick folder. Bank transfers, emails, records of payments that never actually went to contractors. I flipped through the pages, barely able to believe what I was seeing. This wasn't just HOA corruption. This was fraud, big enough to land Karen in serious legal trouble. Greg's hand shook as he pushed the folder toward me. I kept quiet for too long, but after what you did, seeing people finally stand up to her, I can't do it anymore. I met his gaze, seeing the guilt and fear behind his eyes. You did the right thing, I said. And this is the final nail in her coffin. As I walked out of the diner, folder tucked under my arm, I realized one thing. Karen thought she was untouchable. She had no idea she was about to lose everything. I barely slept that night. Not out of fear, but out of anticipation. The pieces were finally falling into place. Karen had spent years building her little empire of fear and manipulation, but now, she was standing on a crumbling foundation, and I had the final push to bring it all down. By morning, the news had exploded. The articles had already made waves, but Greg's documents? That was the spark that turned everything into a wildfire. The story was everywhere. Local news, online forums, even social media. HOA president accused of fraud. Hundreds of thousands missing from neighborhood funds. By noon, people were furious. The same neighbors who once ignored Karen's demands were now standing in groups, whispering, pointing at her house like it was a crime scene. And then, just as I was sipping my morning coffee, my phone rang. I checked the caller ID. Unknown number. I let it ring once, twice. Then I answered. You think you've won? Karen's voice was different now. Gone was the smug superiority, the quiet confidence of someone who believed they were untouchable. This was the voice of a cornered animal. You don't know what you've done, she seethed. You have no idea how bad this is going to get for you. I leaned back, letting her words roll off me like rain. I think you meant to say for you. She sucked in a breath, but I cut her off before she could spit more venom. I've got records, Karen. Proof of everything you've done. The cops are already involved, and the news has it all. This is over. Silence. Then she laughed. A dry, brittle sound. You really think you can take me down that easily? You think I don't have connections? I built this HOA. I own this neighborhood. You're just a nuisance, and nuisances get removed. I rolled my eyes. You're done making threats. The only thing you own is a pending fraud investigation. More silence. Then she hung up. I exhaled, shaking my head. She was unraveling, and the best part? She knew it. But the real fireworks came later that afternoon. I was sitting on my porch, watching the neighborhood buzz with nervous energy, when the first police car rolled up. Then another. A few seconds later, Karen's front door burst open. Officers swarmed inside, and within minutes, they were dragging her out in handcuffs. Neighbors stepped out of their houses, phones raised, whispering as Karen, the almighty Karen *, was shoved into the back of a squad car. Her perfect blonde hair was a mess, her carefully curated image in tatters. She thrashed, shouting, but her voice was lost in the murmurs of the crowd. The officer closest to me caught my eye and gave me a small nod. I returned it, feeling a wave of satisfaction crash over me. It was done. Karen was out. The reign of terror was over. But that wasn't the end. In the weeks that followed, the HOA board collapsed under the weight of Karen's corruption. Some members resigned in disgrace. Others, the ones who had enabled her, faced their own legal battles. The missing money? That was still being investigated. But what mattered was that people weren't afraid anymore. One by one, neighbors started talking again, coming together, rebuilding. One afternoon, I was sitting outside when Mrs. Stevens walked up, a small smile on her face. You did it, she said, her voice full of something I hadn't heard before. Hope. You took her down. I chuckled. We took her down. She nodded, looking around the neighborhood. Feels different now, doesn't it? I glanced around, watching kids ride bikes down the street without worried parents peeking through curtains. Homeowners chatting without fear of some ridiculous new fine. Yeah, it felt different. It felt like home.